Niccolò Machiavelli, the famed Florentine theorist, writer, and scholar, is really one of the most representative figures of the Southern or Italian Renaissance. And indeed, as we noticed in our introductory lecture, the Southern Renaissance was characterized by its fervid embrace of classical humanism and classical learning, a posture, philosophic and moral, which in many ways stood in tension to the received Christian tradition and values, and nowhere is this more obvious than in the work of Machiavelli. This is true in both his Prince, which we'll be examining in this lecture, and his Discourses, a far larger work devoted to republican government. I mention the Discourses only because it's important to keep in mind that while the Prince is a handbook for principi, or rulers, Machiavelli's own politics were in fact republican. He had been a lesser figure in the Florentine Republic prior to the rise of the Medicis, and in his Discourses on Livy expressed his rationale for embracing republican government and the forms which it would require, and we'll touch on those as we discuss the Prince. Ostensibly, the Prince is written for Lorenzo de' Medici, the new ruler of Florence, in order to presumably prompt him to unify Italy and drive out the barbaric French invaders, but obviously was also intended to secure him a post as a minister in Medici's government. Other scholars have argued that it was probably actually first drafted not for Lorenzo, but for his brother, the Pope. Nonetheless, it is a supremely practical work, a work devoted to the question of how one acquires, secures, holds, and improves princely power, and by princely power we mean the power of a principe or a ruler or leader, not necessarily a hereditary monarch. And its stark realism is in fact both critically important to and representative of that very tension between the idealism of the Christian tradition and the realism that Machiavelli at least found in classical thought. And I want to read a brief passage that he expresses in chapter 15 for Lorenzo. Many have imagined republics and principalities which have never been seen or known to exist in reality. For how we live is so far removed from how we ought to live that he who abandons what is done for what ought to be done will rather learn to bring about his own ruin than his preservation. A man who wishes to make a profession of goodness in everything must necessarily come to grief among so many who are not good. Therefore, it is necessary for a prince who wishes to maintain himself to learn how not to be good and to use this knowledge and not use it according to the necessity of the case. Okay, so what we're going to do in this lecture is examine Machiavelli's analysis of various sorts of regimes. And in so doing, we'll see he's really formulating the sort of foundational principles of modern political science, as well as, in addition to the various forms of regime, the questions of how one acquires and secures power in those regimes, and what sort of virtues the prince should have, both in reputation and in practice. Well, Machiavelli analyzes all principalities or states on the basis of whether they are first either the result of a long line of dynastic or established hereditary monarchy, or are newly found states. He argues that the former, those which are in fact dynastic, traditional states, are fairly easy to maintain as long as tradition and custom are respected. Which is to say, if you are in the hereditary monarch of a state whose dynasty has controlled it for a while, as long as you obey the customs and mores of the community, it's quite easy to hold on to power. And this is a finding which indeed Weber would confirm later on in his discussion of traditional authority. What's more interesting are the latter sorts of principalities, those which are newly founded. And they're much more difficult to control and retain, because men who've once changed masters to overthrow an old monarch and put a new, or an old ruler and put a new one in place, are quite amenable to doing that again when you are the ruler. So the real difficulty in such a situation will depend on a variety of different factors. If the kingdom that is newly established has the same culture and language as the prince, the situation is not as critical as it might otherwise be. The prince needs simply make sure to eliminate all the members of the old royal family so that there's no reversionary interest, and the populace will hardly notice the difference. He adduces many examples from his own time. We could think of the replacement of the Stuarts by the House of Hanover in England, which to this day most Americans still don't know actually occurred. It was a fairly seamless transition. One might also think of the reaction of peasants to the demise of the Romanovs and the rise of Lenin, something that many of them may not have even noticed as a profound impact on their lives outside of some procedural reforms. So, and again, in both of those cases, they followed the wisdom of the prince, not entirely. Lenin did kill off all of the family of the Romanovs. The Hanoverians were not lucky enough to see all of the Stuarts executed when they were exiled, and the result was a series of Jacobite risings in the 18th century, again confirming Machiavelli's insight. A much more ticklish situation occurs when the prince is the head of a new kingdom with a language and culture which is different from his own. In that case, it requires real skill and virtu, or mastery, to be able to maintain power. Well, the prince has a couple of different options. First, Machiavelli enjoins the prince to reside in that new territory. And this is because problems and insurrections are much easier to both detect and fix if the ruler is, as it were, on the spot. Secondly, the prince should always attempt to plant colonies at strategic locations in the new principality, colonies of people who share his language and customs. This was, in fact, the practice of both the Romans and ancient Greeks. Such colonies, he argues, are cheaper than garrisons and more effective because they create pro-government forces, populations which are dependent on the new prince, and create factions within the society, making it easier for the prince to divide and conquer. And of course, the prince should always side with his less powerful neighbors against his more powerful rivals. And again, the classical examples are in Rome's expansion into Sicily and southern Europe. They sided with the weaker Greek city-states against the stronger Carthaginians. The great counterexample, of course, is that of Louis of France in Naples that Machiavelli discusses, but we can, in our own history in the 20th century, the centuries that just passed, think of several examples as well. In both world wars, the United States sided with the side that would have lost had we not entered, and in that way assured that when the war ended, we would emerge as the hegemon. One might also think of England taking that same role with regards to the Napoleonic Wars, siding with all of the weaker states of continental Europe against the great rival of Napoleonic France. Okay, now all principalities are governed by the prince with the aid of either ministers, who are appointed by his favor, or baronial lords, whose position is hereditary. And here we think of the great quasi-feudal regimes. In the former case, as for example 16th century Turkey, the prince will always have much more power than in the latter, as in the case of 16th century France. Regimes with ministers, right, those like Turkey, are difficult to conquer. And that's because the government is centralized under the despot. And therefore, that government is much more effective and efficient. Resources can be applied to military problems in a much more direct way. On the other hand, once such regimes are conquered, they're quite easy to hold. And that's because those states are used to centralized control, and the only thing that has changed is the name and person of the leader. And again, we might think of the examples of Darius's conquest of Persia, the conquest of Darius's Persia by Alexander the Great in the classical period, once the centralized regime of Persia was overthrown and a new figure placed at its head. There was very little in the way of resistance, and indeed, had his generals not fought amongst themselves after his demise, Machiavelli suggests that they would have held Persia quite easily for an extended period. It's an entirely different case when you're looking at something like 16th century France, where the prince does not have ministers, but has hereditary barons as his advisors. Such regimes are, in fact, quite easy to conquer because they're decentralized. And it's easy to play the barons off against their hereditary monarch because many of them think of that monarch as nothing more than the first among equals. And indeed, we can think of the Fronde in 17th century France, and we can think of the, the circumstances that led to the rise of the Tudors in England. However, once conquered, they're extremely difficult to hold. And that's because the barons continue to retain their independent power base and are capable of resistance and rebellion. Now, here's where we turn to the last form of regime, and its conquest, the question of conquest and holding of it. And here's where we find, again, that expression of Machiavelli's true Republican sentiments, when he talks about free cities, by which he means Republican city-states. Free cities are extremely difficult to conquer and hold because they have traditions of independence and liberty. And indeed, once acquired, the prince really has two choices. One, he can despoil them. That's what Rome did to Carthage. Absolutely destroy them and raze them to the ground. And reside there himself. Or he can give the city autonomy under a friendly local elite, as Rome did in the Greek city-states, and simply take tribute. This is what Rome did in Greece, and it's also what Sparta did to its allies. Unfortunately, Machiavelli states, the latter, that policy of creating a local elite and extracting tribute, that latter strategy almost always fails. And either the first strategy, that of just simply despoiling the countryside, or the second, of moving there yourself and ruling it, become necessary. As Machiavelli states, whoever becomes the ruler of a free city and does not destroy it can expect to be destroyed by it, for it can always find a motive for rebellion in the name of the liberty and of its ancient usages. And here Machiavelli is gesturing at the remarkable civic virtue of Republican free cities. And that's the source of its internal strength. And we'll see when we talk about, if time permitting, military orders. That's why he argues, in fact, in one way, at least practically speaking, republics are the best forms of government, precisely because people have a commitment to the public civic culture. They are essentially a large armed camp and are capable of conquering almost all of their rival states. All right, now let's look at the circumstances under which a prince will take power. In some cases, the prince will be a private citizen who rises to power either through his own efforts or abilities or through the fortune and efforts of others. In the former case, when you've done it on your own, as it were, such princes find it quite difficult to acquire new possessions because of the new rules they're forced to impose. Right? The reformer has enemies in all, and I quote here, enemies in all those who profit by the old order, and only lukewarm defenders in all those who would profit by the new order. Once obtained and reformed, however, these territories are easy to hold. And he gives the example of Cyrus over the Medes. Again, quite difficult to take that power, creating a new empire. But once he has, he's really defined the rules of the game. And it's for these same reasons that those who come up with new orders really require military support. And perhaps the best example of this are prophets. Machiavelli says, armed prophets are successful, while unarmed ones invariably fail. As I quote, it is easy to persuade the people of a thing, but difficult to keep them in that persuasion. So as he argues, Moses and Muhammad were successful because they had military allies, which allowed them to enforce their new discipline and obligations on their populations. His contemporary Savonarola was a failure because he did not have the military means to enforce his rule in Florence. Now, in the other case, we look at princes who, or people who become princes either through luck or fortuna, or the efforts of others. They have an easy ascent to power, but a very tough time holding on to it. The exact inverse of those who arise to power from their own actions. And that's because, having been placed in power by others, they depend on the goodwill of those benefactors, and are vulnerable if that goodwill dries up or they die. And in his case, the classic example is that of Caesar Borgia, the son of Pope Alexander VI, who was dependent on his father in large part to be able to become the Duke of Romagna. And when his father died at an untimely moment, Caesar Borgia was not in a position to be able to hold on to his power. It was that ill fortune which brought him down. Well, some princes rise to power through villainy, while others are elevated to that position by the support of their fellow citizens. And here we can think of, in our own case, democratically elected political leaders. Those who arise to power through villainy, if you are such a villain, it is prudent for you to commit all your acts of cruelty at once, and afterwards soften the rule. And again, we could look at the wonderful example of Caesar Borgia, who he thinks is a genius in his practice of prudence, or political virtue, or virtu, I should say. And as this part is worthy of note and of imitation by others, I will not omit mention of it. When he took the Romagna, it had previously been governed by weak rulers, who had rather despoiled their subjects than governed them, and given them more cause for disunion than for union, so that the province was a prey to robbery, assaults, and every kind of disorder. He therefore judged it necessary to give them a good government in order to make them peaceful and obedient to his rule. For this purpose he appointed Messer Ramiro de Orca, a cruel and able man, to whom he gave the fullest authority. This man in a short time was highly successful in rendering the country orderly and united. Whereupon the Duke, this is Caesar Borgia, not deeming such excessive authority expedient, lest it should become hateful, appointed a civil court of justice in the center of the province under an excellent president, to which each city appointed its own advocate. As he knew that the harshness of the past had engendered some amount of hatred, in order to purge the minds of the people and to win them over completely, he resolved to show that if any cruelty had taken place, it was not by his orders, but through the harsh disposition of his minister. And having found the opportunity, he had, and this is Mr. Orca, cut in half and placed one morning on the public square at Cesena, with a piece of wood and blood-stained knife by his side. The ferocity of this spectacle caused the people both satisfaction and amazement. And again, I think it may sound a rather ghoulish description of political practice, but it is in fact quite realistic. It's based on empirical observation. A prince elevated to power by his fellow citizens, on the other hand, will need to play off the various factions of society, and in 16th and 15th century Italy, that would have been the great people against the little, the nobles against the commoners. Either class will create a prince when it fears that the other is too strong. That's why princely powers are created within republican free city-states, so as to restrain the other class, which it fears is encroaching on its privileges. But as he points out, it's harder to rule when one is elevated by the nobility, because they will always think of you as their equal and never as their superior. But the people, on the other hand, are always satisfied with your rule if you simply don't oppress them. Right? So it's actually wiser to side with the people against the elite. But in either case, the prince should ultimately attempt to gain the favor of the people. And he does that by protecting them against the nobles who are his natural rivals. And he should also make sure that the people always need him. And to do that, he must ensure their social welfare and their military protection. Now, it's important to note that in addition to just good laws, the basic foundation of any regime is good arms. And it is the fact, again, to recur to his republicanism, that in a republic, people feel a commitment to the public good that he thinks makes republics great only if those republics have universal military conscription, as the Romans did, and as he argued that the Italians should practice. In either case, however, the ruler must study military arts, as well as their historical practice. Looking at the question of the construction of an army, armies are either made of mercenaries, auxiliaries, which are forces of allies, or your own nationally conscripted militia. According to Machiavelli, and this is part of his notion of civic humanism, only the militia is a safe form of military. Why? Well, first of all, mercenaries are dangerous. They're dangerous because they're disunited, they are faithless, they are ambitious, and according to Machiavelli, they are cowardly. Think of the military leaders of mercenary armies. Their captains are either incompetent, in which case they're useless, or, if they are competent, they're quite likely to be untrustworthy because if they are quite competent and they win battles, they'll question whether they should be paid by you or replace you. And there's no reason they can't. It's his argument that it's the use of mercenaries in Italy by free city-states that's led to its downfall and the incursions of what he considers the barbaric French. Well, the use of allies is equally dangerous, but for different reasons. If your allies win for you, then you're beholden to them and are, in a sense, their prisoner. One might think of the relationship between the United States and Great Britain and France in World War II. We were auxiliary forces to their struggle against Germany, and once having secured victory, we became a permanent presence within Europe militarily. And in 1956, when Great Britain and France marked out an independent foreign policy in Suez, we used our geopolitical might to enforce their retreat from that position. Literally told them that after they'd seized the Suez Canal, that they would turn it back to Egypt and apologize, which they did. And I quote, "The greatest danger with mercenaries lies in their cowardice and reluctance to fight, but with auxiliaries, the danger lies in their courage." Well, now I want to turn to the question of what are the virtues that a prince should have. Well, it's better for a prince to have the reputation for cheapness than to be too liberal or generous with his resources. Sumptuous display and generosity, which is necessary to gain a reputation for liberality, will cause the prince to raise taxes. And Machiavelli argues that sort of rapaciousness will incur the hatred of the people. That's the worst mistake you can make. A reputation for cheapness may bring disgrace. You may not have the reputation of a grand prince, but it will never cause the hatred of your own people. While liberality will force that rapaciousness, which will result in both disgrace and hatred. And I quote, "Niggardliness is one of those vices which will enable him, the prince, to reign." Take another set of virtues, cruelty versus clemency, the latter being the Christian virtue. Machiavelli argues that it is sometimes better to show cruelty than clemency. If clemency leads to lawlessness, then cruelty will become necessary anyway. If one practices a sort of laissez-faire towards the social order, in which criminal justice issues and law and order is not strictly enforced, it will ultimately result in chaos, which will ultimately force your hand towards some sort of military despotism. So you might as well practice cruelty from the outset in order to create social order, fealty, and the unity of society, all of which are necessary for a well-governed state. Finally, and most famously, it is better to be feared than loved. For love is fickle, while fear is constant. Now, it's important to note, fear need not and should not bring hatred. Machiavelli never enjoins one oppressing one's people so that they come to hate you. Hatred must always be avoided. The key to avoiding hatred when practicing cruelty and instilling fear is never to take the property of your citizens. And this, I think, was a deep and realistic insight into political society. And I quote, "When he is obliged to take the life of anyone, let him do so when there is a proper justification and manifest reason for it. But above all, he must abstain from taking the property of others. For men forget more easily the death of their father than the loss of their patrimony." And again, it's a classic sort of Machiavellian doctrine, but in many ways I think it is quite realistic. If your father was executed in a political and military purge, that's something that will anger you, but there's nothing you can do to bring your father back. But if your estate is taken, well, there's quite a bit you can do to recover your estate. And that's probably something you'll plan to do for the rest of your life. Now, many people who have very little careful study of Machiavelli assume that he is in fact enjoining a sort of utter ruthlessness at all costs. That's not actually the case. Machiavelli doesn't believe in the Christian virtues, but he also does believe in classical virtues, and he does not ever enjoin villainy. Which is to say, what inspires the quest for political power is the quest for greatness, and what inspires the quest for greatness is glory. and there is no glory in villainy. So there is a real limit to what the prince can do. Those who would see Machiavelli as people who would lay down the principles of a Hitler or a Stalin misread Machiavelli. As he speaks of Agathocles, the famed tyrant in Sicily, he states, "It cannot be called virtue to kill one's fellow citizens, betray one's friends, be without faith, without pity, and without religion. By these methods one may indeed gain power, but not glory. For if the virtues of Agathocles in braving and overcoming perils, and his greatness of soul in supporting and surmounting obstacles be considered, one sees no reason for holding him inferior to any of the most renowned captains. Nevertheless, his barbarous cruelty and inhumanity, together with his countless atrocities, do not permit of his being named among the most famous men. We cannot attribute to fortune or virtue that which he achieved without either." So the practice of ruthlessness in politics is limited by the attempt to avoid straight-out villainy in order for the great political hero, the great man, to achieve immortal glory. And that raises again that Renaissance humanist theme of the sort of man-centered interpretation of the world, where one sort of strives for an immortality in the annals of history rather than through salvific sacrifice. Okay. The prince should also have the reputation for honesty, integrity, and religion, but not necessarily the reality. Right? It's good to have the reputation of being a religious man, but to actually be a religious man at all times is an impediment for the practice of the prince. It is good to have the reputation for being a truth teller, but to always tell the truth, in fact, is not always prudent. He must use both noble force and deceitful cunning when appropriate. And in that way, he is both like the fox, right, who is a cagey, wiry animal, as well as the lion, that brave beast of conquest. The prince must have the reputation for keeping faith, but he must do so only when it is in his interest. And here again he extols the remarkable example of Alexander VI, the great father of Caesar Borgia, the Pope. Alexander VI did nothing else but deceive men. He thought of nothing else and found the occasion for it. No man was ever able to give assurances or affirm things with stronger oaths, and no man observed them less. However, he always succeeded in his deceptions, as he well knew this aspect of things. It is not therefore necessary for a prince to have all the above-named qualities, but it is very necessary to seem to have them. I would even be so bold as to say that to possess them and always to observe them is dangerous, but to appear to possess them is useful. Thus it is well to seem merciful, faithful, humane, sincere, religious, and also to be so. But you must have the mind so disposed that when it is needful to be otherwise, you may be able to change to the opposite qualities. Now again, in our public rhetoric, we rarely will accept such convictions. But when we look at the practice of actual power, we often do agree with such practices. Franklin Roosevelt is largely heralded as a great president for routinely violating the Neutrality Acts and engaging in a private foreign policy, which turned out in the long run to have been right. No one, I think, faulted Dwight David Eisenhower too heavily when he stood up on television and lied about having sent a U-2 spy plane over the Soviet Union. And when that was discovered, it was certainly an embarrassment, but I don't think that most informed Americans thought that that was a lie that destroyed his credibility as a leader. So what are we suggesting? Well, we're suggesting that ultimately what makes the prince a great man and a world historical figure is that he is one of the few figures who is in a position where the ends of his actions always justify the means. In the actions of men, and especially of princes, from which there is no appeal, the end justifies the means. Let a prince therefore aim at conquering and maintaining the state, and the means will always be judged honorable, and praised by everyone, for the vulgar is always taken by appearances and the issue of the event. And the world consists only of the vulgar, and the few who are not vulgar are isolated when the many have a rallying point in the prince. Well, in conclusion, there are several problems that are raised by Machiavelli, which will be the subject of subsequent political philosophy and theory. The relationship of is and ought, of realism versus idealism, the relationship between political science and political philosophy. Nonetheless, Machiavelli's work is critical in establishing the parameters of that tradition, and indeed has influence far beyond it. He's created a new discipline from philosophy, that of political science, and the mark of modern philosophy is that practice of the scientific method. For example, Newton and natural philosophy of mechanics becomes, again, a new discipline from philosophy that called science, used to be called natural philosophy. All of this trajectory of thought begins in the Renaissance, and no figure is more representative of its southern phase than that of Niccolò Machiavelli.